13 things the British government did in Scotland that they've never officially admitted. Some go back more than 3 centuries. Others are still classified right now, locked away in archives that London flatly refuses to open. And the last one, the 13th, puts into question something millions of people believed was real for 700 years. What you're about to hear isn't rumor. These are documented operations, reports declassified decades after the fact, trials where evidence was destroyed on direct cabinet orders, and files that only came to light thanks to transparency laws passed long after the responsible men were dead and buried. I spent weeks going through Ministry of Defence papers, parliamentary records, Freedom of Information releases, and the National Records of Scotland to piece each one of these cases together as accurately as possible. What's at stake here isn't some academic argument about the past. It's the difference between what a government admits and what it actually did over centuries in a country it never quite stopped treating as its own property. And here's the uncomfortable part. A lot of what you're about to hear remains officially unacknowledged at this very moment, as we speak. And the last item on this list, the one I'm saving for the end, suggests that even the most sacred object in Scottish history, the one sitting beneath the throne where British monarchs are crowned, isn't what the world has been told it is for 700 years. In the summer of 1952, people in the small village of North Tolster, on the Isle of Lewis, noticed something strange off their coastline. A large ship anchored a few hundred yards from shore. Next to it, a floating platform with cages on the deck. Inside those cages, live monkeys and guinea pigs. Some locals still remember seeing a white mist hanging over the water for days at a time, right after alarms went off on the ship. Nobody in the village knew what was happening. The government had stamped the operation top secret, and locals were told it was simply naval exercises. The truth was something else entirely. The ship was called the Ben Lomond. The platform was a biological warfare laboratory, and what they were releasing into the air just a few hundred yards from people's homes was an aerosol containing live bacteria, bubonic plague, pneumonic plague, brucellosis and tularemia. The operation was codenamed Cauldron, and it was a joint project between the United Kingdom, the United States and Canada, with a US Navy officer on board. 3,492 guinea pigs and 83 monkeys were placed in cages on the platform, dosed with the airborne pathogens, then cut open so scientists could measure the results. But on the 18th of September, during the final test using live plague bacteria, a fishing trawler called the Corella sailed straight into the test zone without knowing anything about it. She was heading home from the Iceland fishing grounds with 18 men on board. The crew ignored the warning flags and sailed clean through a cloud of live Yersinia pestis, the same bacterium that caused the Black Death, which kills almost everyone it infects if left untreated. The decision made at the very top of the British government was straightforward. Don't stop the trawler. Don't warn the crew. Cover it up. A Navy destroyer was sent out from the Clyde with a supply of vaccine on board, ordered to stay just over the horizon and listen for distress calls. That secret watch lasted 21 days, even while the crew came ashore in the port town of Fleetwood and walked among their own families. The men of the Corella lived out the rest of their lives, never knowing what had happened to them. Some only found out 50 years later when a BBC documentary crew showed up at their doors. Once the danger had passed, most of the documents relating to the incident were ordered to be burned, not filed away, burned. The whole operation stayed hidden for 30 years, until a civil servant named Clive Ponting stumbled across the one surviving file and leaked the story to a national newspaper. When a Scottish MP asked for an inquiry in 1994, the Ministry of Defence replied that the Cauldron files remained classified and that releasing them would not be in the national interest. More than 70 years later, they still are. On the 13th of June, 1814, in a remote valley in the north of Scotland called Strathnavor, an elderly woman named Margaret Mackay lay sick in a stone cottage. She was past 70 and couldn't walk without help. That morning, a group of men arrived, under the orders of a lawyer named Patrick Seller, who managed the estate of the Duchess of Sutherland. Their job was to clear the valley of people and fill it with sheep. When the men set fire to the cottage, Margaret was still inside. Her daughter Janet dragged her out through the flames, with the blankets still burning on her body. Margaret died 5 days later in a nearby shed. That summer, Sellers' men burned the homes of 430 families across the valley, roughly 2,000 people. A local stonemason named Donald MacLeod, who witnessed it all firsthand, wrote it down years later. He watched the whole valley go dark with smoke. He saw elderly men wandering in a daze, not knowing where to go. He saw women go into early labor, out in the open. He saw children die of exposure to the cold. The young men of the valley weren't there. The Duchess of Sutherland herself had recruited them years earlier for the British Army, on a written promise that their families would be allowed to keep their land. That promise was broken while they were fighting for the British Empire abroad. Patrick Seller was put on trial in 1816 for manslaughter and arson. He was acquitted in the early hours of the morning by a jury made up of landowners and merchants who shared the same financial interests as his employers. Between 1811 and 1821, around 15,000 people were removed from the Sutherland estate alone, at the time the largest private estate in Europe. The total number of deaths across the whole period of the Highland clearances, from 1750 through to 1860, was never officially recorded. The Church of Scotland, which was controlled by the landowners, preached from the pulpit that the evictions were the will of God. More than 2 centuries later, no British government has ever issued a formal apology for the Highland clearances, or officially acknowledged that this was a program of mass displacement, backed by the state and approved by the courts. Scotland remains the country with the most unequal distribution of land in Europe. More than half of Scotland is still owned by fewer than 500 people, and that same Valley of Strathnavor would later become part of the region where the British government built its most contaminating nuclear facility. But that story has its own chapter. By 1973, North Sea oil was reshaping European politics, and the Scottish National Party had gone from 1% of the vote to more than 30% in under a decade. The Conservative government of Edward Heath, growing concerned, commissioned an urgent internal report from an economist at the Scottish office named Gavin Macrone. The question was direct. If Scotland became independent and kept its oil, just how wealthy would it be? Macrone's 18-page report was delivered in April 1974. It was immediately stamped secret, with the same level of restriction normally applied to sensitive military files. He wrote that an independent Scotland would have a chronic financial surplus to a quite embarrassing degree, that its currency would become one of the strongest in Europe, and that oil revenues for 1980 alone were expected to reach between £1.5 and £3 billion a year, far higher than what the SNP itself was claiming in its campaigns. When Harold Wilson's Labour government came to power months later, they received the report and kept the same classification in place. For 30 years, Conservative and Labour governments took turns in Downing Street, and every single one of them kept it locked away. Meanwhile, in public debates and referendum campaigns, the official message was the complete opposite. Scotland was too small, too poor, too dependent to stand on its own. The report only became public in 2005, when new Freedom of Information laws allowed an activist named Davy Hutchison to track it down through declassified files. But the most damning confirmation came from former Labour Chancellor Denis Healey, who admitted in 2013 that his government had deliberately downplayed the value of Scottish oil because of the threat of nationalism, that Westminster politicians were, in his own words, worried stiff about Scotland getting hold of its own oil. Today, Norway's sovereign oil fund is worth more than $1.5 trillion. Every Norwegian citizen is technically a millionaire because of it. Britain has no such fund. The Macrone report stayed classified long enough for 3 generations of Scottish voters to make major constitutional choices without ever knowing what was inside it. In 1942, the British Ministry of Defence bought a small island called Gruinard off the northwest coast of Scotland for £500. It was presented as a routine wartime purchase. The truth was that Dr. David Henderson, head of biological weapons research at the Porton Down facility, needed somewhere remote enough to test an anthrax bomb. Scientists shipped around 80 sheep to the island, tied them in position around the blast area, and detonated small explosive charges packed with anthrax spores. The sheep were dead within days. The experiment was considered a success, but anthrax spores can survive in soil for decades without losing their ability to infect. something the scientists knew perfectly well before they started. When the trials finished, the island was so badly contaminated that all visits were banned, and warning signs were placed along the nearby mainland coast. What the government didn't admit for decades was that for 24 years, those warning signs didn't even mention the word anthrax. An internal government review in 1971 concluded that cleaning up the island was too expensive and quietly shelved the matter. A cow on the mainland, on the far side of the bay, died of anthrax. Some local people fell ill. The government said nothing. In October 1981, a group calling themselves the Dark Harvest Commandos sent letters to newspapers claiming they had removed 300 pounds of contaminated soil from the island and would deposit it at government sites around the country until action was taken. A package left outside the Porton Down facility tested positive for live anthrax. Another appeared at the Conservative Party conference. The government was forced to act. Decontamination began in 1986, 44 years after the original experiment. 280 tons of formaldehyde solution were sprayed across the entire island. The most contaminated topsoil was removed, and test sheep were brought in to check the results. The island was declared safe in April 1990. The original owner's heirs bought it back for the same £500. Nobody was ever prosecuted. No government has ever officially admitted that a piece of inhabited Scottish coastline was left contaminated with a deadly biological agent for nearly half a century. At 6:49 on the morning of the 22nd of May, 1915, at a signal box called Quinton's Hill, near Gretna Green in southern Scotland, the worst rail disaster in British history took place. A troop train carrying the 7th Battalion of the Royal Scots, nearly 500 soldiers from the Port District of Leith in Edinburgh, crashed head-on into a local passenger train that had been left on the wrong track by mistake. A minute later, an express train from Glasgow ploughed into the wreckage. The carriages, built from old timber and lit by gas lamps, caught fire within seconds. At least 227 people died, 216 of them Royal Scots soldiers. Some historians believe the real number was higher. Here is the part the British government never properly told the public. It was 1915. The entire press was under wartime censorship. The battalion was on its way to Liverpool to sail to Gallipoli, one of the most catastrophic campaigns of the war. And the truth that the regiment had been wiped out on British soil because two careless signalmen had falsified their shift handover records and waved a troop train onto a blocked line was the kind of story the government couldn't allow to land fully with the public during an active recruitment drive. Of the 216 soldiers' bodies, only 83 were ever identified. The rest were destroyed in the fire. Press coverage was minimal and tightly managed, focused entirely on blaming the two signalmen, James Tinsley and George Meakin, with no examination of why troops were being moved in outdated wooden carriages, lit by gas, on a line already overloaded with wartime traffic. The two men were convicted, served just over a year, and were rehired by the same railway company. Tinsley went back as a lamp operator. Meakin set himself up as a coal merchant beside the same stretch of track where the soldiers had died. The official report, closed in June 1915, blamed the signalmen and went no further. No public inquiry was ever held into the use of outdated rolling stock for troop transport. Britain's worst rail disaster happened on Scottish soil, killed mostly Scottish soldiers, was minimised by censors in Westminster, and a complete account of the decisions that made it possible has never been published. In the housing estates of Easterhouse, Drumchapel, Castlemilk and Pollock in Glasgow, a man in his 50s is 30% more likely to die before the age of 65 than a man of the same age, living in the same level of poverty, in Liverpool or Manchester. That gap has been known in public health circles for years as the Glasgow effect. For a long time, it was treated as a mystery nobody could explain. It isn't a mystery anymore. In 2016, a joint team from the Glasgow Centre for Population Health, NHS Health Scotland, the University of the West of Scotland, and University College London published the most thorough study ever done on why Glasgow has worse health outcomes than comparable cities. They tested 40 different theories: genetics, alcohol, diet, culture, climate. None of them explained the gap on its own. What the research actually found was something different. Glasgow had been made systematically more vulnerable than other post-industrial cities by specific political decisions made in Westminster and the Scotland Office over decades. Glasgow was formally labelled a declining city in government planning documents during the 1960s. Investment, industry and skilled workers were deliberately redirected away from the city and into artificially created new towns like Cumbernauld and East Kilbride. Massive housing developments like Easterhouse were thrown up quickly, with no services, no public transport, no nearby employment, and then largely abandoned when government policy shifted toward retail in the 1980s. The collapse of industry along the Clyde, the shipyards, steelworks and mines, wasn't a natural event. It was accelerated by traceable decisions made by the central government. Dr. David Walsh of the Glasgow Centre for Population Health put it plainly. Even taking into account Glasgow's very high levels of deprivation, its health is much worse than it should be, and much worse than in equally deprived cities like Liverpool and Manchester. The researchers eventually stopped calling it the Glasgow effect and renamed it a political effect, saying the solutions needed to be political too. No British government has ever officially acknowledged that its industrial and urban planning policies contributed in a measurable way to a multi-year life expectancy gap between Scottish citizens in Glasgow and English citizens living in equivalent poverty further south. The dead appear in statistics as victims of smoking, alcohol, or heart disease. But behind every one of those categories, the most exhaustive study ever done on the subject points to the same origin: decades of decisions made in offices 500 miles away. Sandside Bay is a public beach on the far north coast of Scotland. People walk their dogs there. Children collect shells along the waterline. What very few visitors know is that, from 1983 right through to the present day, teams with Geiger counters have removed more than 200 radioactive particles from this one beach. Some of them are fragments of irradiated nuclear fuel, radioactive enough to cause serious internal damage if swallowed or inhaled. The source of those particles sits less than a mile away, just around the headland. It's called Dounreay. Dounreay was built in the 1950s as Britain's main centre for experimental nuclear reactor research. Over 4 decades, extremely careless waste management practices dumped contaminated material into the sea and the ground beneath the site. Between 1963 and 1984, small fragments of spent nuclear fuel rods were pumped directly into the sea through the plant's discharge pipe. In 1977, a 65-metre shaft that had been used informally as a dump for nuclear waste, and which also contained metallic sodium, was flooded with seawater. The sodium reacted violently. The resulting explosion blew the heavy steel and concrete caps off the shaft and scattered radioactive particles across the surrounding area. The incident was kept secret for 19 years, only made public in 1996. The beach adjacent to the plant was closed in 1983. Fishing was banned within a 2-kilometre radius in 1997. When the first radioactive fragments appeared on Sandside Bay, the UK Atomic Energy Authority told the local press the material was comparable to the luminous dial of a wall clock. 2 decades later, it was admitted that some of the particles found were between 10 and 100 times more radioactive than anything found previously, and that this discovery had been deliberately concealed since 2004. In 2007, the UKA was fined £140,000 for illegally dumping radioactive waste at sea for 21 consecutive years. Scotland's environmental regulator has since officially conceded that a full clean-up of the seabed is not achievable, that some particles will remain hazardous for around 200 years, and that the goal of returning the environment to a clean condition has been formally dropped. Full decommissioning of the Dounreay site has been pushed back to 2070. The land isn't expected to be suitable for general public use until the year 2336. On the 7th of April, 1985, a car was found crashed in a ditch on a remote stretch of road in the Scottish Highlands. Inside, still wearing his seatbelt, was Willie McRae, a lawyer, former naval officer, vice-chairman of the Scottish National Party, and the most prominent public voice in Scotland against the British government's plans to store nuclear waste beneath the Highlands. He had a gunshot wound to the head. The revolver was found the following day, 18 metres from the car, in the stream running alongside the road. The official verdict was suicide. Several things about this case were never explained. A revolver does not travel 18 meters from inside a closed car on its own. The police moved the vehicle before properly documenting the scene, then recorded a location that an eyewitness later proved was wrong by more than a mile. And Donald John Morrison, a former police officer and the last man known to have spoken to McCrae, stated in his original declaration that his sergeant had warned him that same week to stay away from McCrae's offices because a joint special branch and MI5 operation was actively targeting the lawyer. When Morrison later used Freedom of Information laws to request a copy of his own statement, he found it had been replaced with a falsified version carrying a photocopied version of his signature, with no mention of surveillance, MI5 or special branch anywhere in it. In 2008, newly declassified government files confirmed what had long been dismissed as nationalist paranoia, that the SNP had been infiltrated and monitored by MI5 and special branch from at least the 1950s onward. In 2015, The Guardian revealed that GHQ, Britain's intelligence listening agency, had been operating under a secret authorization to eavesdrop on politicians from the Scottish, Welsh, and Northern Irish parliaments, directly contradicting a decades-old rule that barred electronic surveillance of elected representatives. A petition for a formal inquiry into McCrae's death gathered more than 13,000 signatures in 2015. The Crown Office refused. When the physical evidence from the case was subsequently requested, police said it was no longer in their possession and they couldn't explain where it had gone. The file remains officially closed. The British government has never acknowledged that Willie McCrae was under active surveillance by its security services in the days before his death. Loch Long is a long, deep-sea inlet on the west coast of Scotland, about an hour's drive from Glasgow. Through the warmer months, it's used by kayakers, divers, anglers, and swimmers. What almost none of them know is that radioactive water has drained into it on multiple occasions from the most sensitive nuclear weapons facility in the United Kingdom, the Coulport complex, sitting just a few hundred meters from the shoreline. Coulport, alongside the Faslane submarine base, is where Britain's Trident nuclear weapons are stored, maintained, and processed. It houses the warheads for the Royal Navy's ballistic missile submarines. Internal documents kept secret for 6 years, and only released in 2025 after a court order from Scotland's Information Commissioner revealed the following. Pipes burst inside the nuclear weapons processing area at Coulport in 2010, twice in 2019, and twice more in 2021. The burst in August 2019 released significant amounts of water into the weapons processing zone, where it became contaminated with radioactive tritium and drained into Loch Long. The Royal Navy's own internal review acknowledged a breakdown in safety communication. 23 corrective actions were formally committed to. More pipes burst the following year. The Scottish investigative outlet The Ferret, which spent years in court obtaining these documents, also revealed that since 2023 alone, 12 incidents at Faslane have been formally classified by the Ministry of Defence itself as carrying actual or high potential for radioactive release into the environment. The Ministry of Defence has refused to provide any details about any of them, citing national security. The Guardian had already reported in 2009 that radioactive coolant had leaked from nuclear submarines into the Firth of Clyde in 2004, 2007, and 2008. The Ministry of Defence's official position is that there have been no unsafe releases of radioactive material into the environment at any point. The internal documents, now public, tell a more complicated story. As recently as 2020, around half of the components in use at the Coulport complex were already past their designed operational lifespan. This information is only public today because Scottish journalists spent 6 years fighting through the courts to get it. The British government would never have released it on its own. On the 26th of March 1707, the Parliament of Scotland, which had existed continuously since the 13th century, met for the last time in Edinburgh. 5 days later, it ceased to exist. The Treaty of Union dissolved the independent Kingdom of Scotland into the new Kingdom of Great Britain, with a single parliament at Westminster. The official British account describes it as a voluntary union, the rational outcome of free debate between two sovereign parliaments. The historical record is considerably less tidy than that. Scottish public opinion was overwhelmingly against it. Petitions poured in from trade guilds, parishes and towns. There were riots in Edinburgh, Glasgow and Dumfries. On the day of the signing, the treaty had to be smuggled out of Edinburgh under military escort because of the public mood. Robert Burns, Scotland's national poet, would later capture the popular verdict in a single line that is still known across Scotland today. Bought and sold for English gold, such a parcel of rogues in a nation. The documented facts are these. The Duke of Queensberry, the royal commissioner tasked with pushing the treaty through, distributed honours, pensions, back payments of unpaid salaries, and direct cash payments to secure votes among members of the Scottish Parliament. The total documented sum was £20,000 sterling, of which £12,300 went to Queensberry himself. The remaining £7,700 was divided among 29 parliamentarians, many of whom were owed money the Scottish government had never paid them. Whether that counts as straightforward bribery or payment of legitimate debts is historically debated. That the payments happened and were concealed from the Scottish people at the time is not. The equivalent, a payment of around £398,000 made to Scotland to compensate for taking on a share of England's national debt, was largely redirected to investors who had lost money in the failed Darien scheme, Scotland's disastrous attempt to establish a colony in Central America. In practical terms, a significant portion of the men voting for the treaty were the same investors who stood to recover their losses through it. 3 centuries later, no British government has officially acknowledged that the Treaty of Union involved cash payments to individual Scottish parliamentarians during the voting process. A ledger in the Scottish archives with names and exact amounts recorded tells a different story. In 1999, just weeks before the opening of the new Scottish Parliament, the first Scotland had possessed in nearly 300 years, the Labour government of Tony Blair signed an administrative order called the Scottish Adjacent Waters Boundaries Order. The dry, technical name concealed what was, in practical terms, one of the most significant territorial decisions made on Scottish soil in the 20th century. The maritime boundary between Scotland and England, which had been in place since 1987, was quietly shifted northward. Instead of running from Berwick upon Tweed on the historic English-Scottish border, as it previously had, the new line now started from a point near Carnoustie on Scotland's east coast. The effect was immediate. Roughly 6,000 square miles of sea that had historically been considered Scottish waters were reassigned to English fishery and resource zones. In practical terms, this meant that if Scotland ever became independent, those 6,000 square miles, including fish stocks, potential oil and gas reserves, and offshore renewable energy rights, would no longer fall under Scottish jurisdiction. Today, when a golfer stands on the famous Old Course at St Andrews and looks out to the North Sea, under the current official boundary, they are looking at English waters. The decision was presented as a technical adjustment, with no meaningful parliamentary debate, in the weeks before the new Scottish Parliament opened its doors. There was no public consultation in Scotland or in England. The criteria used to draw the new line were never proactively released. For years, most Scottish voters were simply unaware the order existed, including those who later voted in independence referendums without knowing what its maritime consequences would actually be. Professor Sir Crispin Agnew, a specialist in international maritime law, has noted that the straight-line projection method applied in the 1999 order contradicts the historic coastal following method used previously, and that the difference between the two methods is precisely what produced the shift of those 6,000 square miles. No British authority has ever officially conceded that the change was designed to reduce the maritime territory of a potential future Scottish state, but the timing, the lack of debate, and the departure from established practice make it extraordinarily difficult to argue this was a purely technical decision with no political dimension. At 7:02 on the evening of the 21st of December, 1988, Pan Am Flight 103 exploded in the sky over the Scottish town of Lockerbie. 270 people died, 259 on board, and 11 residents on the ground below. It is the worst terrorist attack in British history. The only man ever convicted, Libyan intelligence officer Abdel Basset al-Megrahi, was found guilty in 2001 by a Scottish court sitting in the Netherlands. His conviction rested on 3 main pillars: and every one of those pillars is now publicly known to be seriously flawed. The first was the identification made by a Maltese shopkeeper named Tony Gauci, who said he remembered selling clothing found in the bomb suitcase to a man who looked like Megrahi. But Gauci had previously, in earlier identification sessions, pointed to other men entirely, including Mohammed Abu Talb, a convicted terrorist with documented links to a bomb-making network dismantled by German police just 2 months before Lockerbie. Gauci described the buyer as being over 6 feet tall and older than 50. Megrahi was 5'8" and 37 years old at the time. Gauci also said it was raining that evening and his brother was watching football on television. Weather records and broadcast schedules for that specific day contradict both of those details. Gauci later received $2 million from the US Department of Justice as a reward payment. The second pillar was a small circuit board fragment known as PT/35B, which was attributed to a Libyan-manufactured timer. A veteran Swiss investigator raised serious concerns that this fragment may have been introduced into the Lockerbie wreckage rather than recovered from it. The third was the testimony of a CIA-paid Libyan defector named Abdul Majid Gyaka, whose evidence the judges themselves described as, at best exaggerated, and at worst simply invented. He had said nothing implicating Megrahi for 2.5 years, then suddenly produced a crucial account the very week the CIA was considering cutting off his payments. Former senior CIA officer Robert Baer offered in 2001 to present evidence pointing to a completely different theory, that the bombing had been ordered by Iran and carried out by a Palestinian militant cell in retaliation for the accidental shoot-down of an Iranian passenger plane by a US Navy vessel in July 1988, which killed 290 people. That offer was never taken up, and the evidence never reached the court. In 2020, Scotland's Criminal Cases Review Commission found grounds to suspect a miscarriage of justice and referred the case back to the courts. Megrahi had died in 2012 without ever being cleared. The British government has never officially acknowledged that the evidence at the trial was inadequate or potentially compromised. In August 1296, the forces of King Edward I of England arrived at Scone Abbey in Perthshire to seize the Stone of Destiny, the sacred block on which the kings of Scotland had been crowned since time immemorial. Edward took it to Westminster, wedged it beneath a wooden throne, and from that day forward every English, and later every British monarch, has been crowned sitting directly above it, as a symbol of dominion over Scotland. That is the version of events that official British history has maintained for 700 years. But there is another version, supported by historians, geologists, and a body of documentary evidence that the British establishment has never been keen to examine closely. The monks of Scone Abbey had 3 months of warning before Edward arrived. The English army crossed the Scottish border in March, but didn't reach Scone until June. That was more than enough time to hide the real stone and hand over a substitute, some ordinary local piece of sandstone, cut to look the part. The evidence supporting this theory is technically solid. Royal seals from before 1296 show Scottish monarchs sitting on a stone that is noticeably taller and more elaborately carved than the block that ended up in Westminster, which stands just 27 centimetres high, roughly the height of a shoebox. The British Geological Survey has confirmed that the Westminster stone is made of lower Old Red sandstone, exactly the type of rock quarried in the local area around Scone, while earlier historical descriptions spoke of a darker material, possibly black marble or basalt. In the Treaty of Northampton, in 1328, England formally offered to return the stone to Scotland as part of a peace settlement. Scotland didn't ask for it, didn't collect it, and showed no interest whatsoever. That makes no sense at all if the Westminster block was genuinely the sacred object, but it makes perfect sense if the Scots already knew the real stone was still safely hidden somewhere on Scottish soil. Edward himself returned to Scone Abbey 2 years later, in 1298, and ransacked it a second time. If he genuinely believed he'd taken the right stone in 1296, why go back to the same monastery? And when Scottish nationalist students briefly returned the Westminster stone to Scotland in 1950, the Glasgow stonemason who repaired it before it was sent back to London was later claimed by witnesses to have sent a copy in its place, keeping the original hidden in Scotland. No independent scientific dating analysis has ever been carried out on the stone. No geological study comparing it directly with rock samples from the bed of the River Tay has ever been published. When King Charles III was crowned in May 2023, he sat on that stone, as his predecessors had done before him. And the question no British government has ever been willing to answer with a proper scientific investigation remains exactly the same as it was 700 years ago. If the monks of Scone outwitted Edward I in the summer of 1296, then every British monarch for 7 centuries has been crowned on a plain block of local sandstone that was never anything more than that. And the real Stone of Destiny would still be out there today, hidden somewhere in Scotland, waiting. The question about the Coronation Stone isn't the only one still hanging in the air. The Operation Cauldron files are still classified. The full Lockerbie documents have never been handed to independent investigators. The true death toll of the clearances will never be fully counted. The cleanup of the seabed off Doon Ray has been officially abandoned. The pipes at Coolport keep bursting. When a government spends centuries hiding what it does in a place, you end up with whole communities whose official history looks nothing like their real one. Towns that appear on old maps and have vanished from new ones. Streets that Google Maps still shows as inhabited, where nobody lives anymore. Some were cleared for military reasons that were never made public. Others were emptied by contamination that was never acknowledged. I've spent the last few weeks tracking down 12 of those cases across the north and west of the United Kingdom. The video is called 12 UK Ghost Towns So Abandoned Even Google Maps Got Them Wrong. Nobody lives there anymore. The link is just above this text.